Hey everyone, today we're going to have a look at what I would consider one of the craziest lines within the King's Gambit, something known as the Allgaier Gambit. So this is a variation of the King's Gambit that looks a little bit like this. So I want you to have a look at this position just to start with, and I want you to assess who is winning in this position. So the knight has just come here and perched himself on this nice outpost on g5, and I want you to have a look at this position and see who you think is winning. We're going to come back to this position in just a moment, but for now, let's go through our video. Hey everyone, so today we're going to be showing off one of my recent games in over-the-board chess, where I actually reached that particular position that you saw at the start in the Allgaier Gambit. And now I was playing on the black side, which is quite interesting because I know quite a lot of theory on the King's Gambit. So whenever the King's Gambit is played against me, I actually accept the Gambit and go for these crazy lines. So the game started with e4, e5, f4 and e takes on f4. Now I should start this video and say, for any maybe intermediate players or any beginner players, when you're faced against the King's Gambit, there's two approaches that you could take. You could either play some of the safer lines, like things like d5, although that can sometimes go a bit crazy with this, but this line is absolutely fine because it really neutralizes, it really defangs the King's Gambit. So after something like this and this, you've got a very simple plan with moving your knight to f6, bishop d6, and then casting, and you get a very good game. But what I would maybe suggest when you're playing against the King's Gambit is to actually accept this gambited pawn. And the reason why I strongly suggest that you do that is that it will really test your tactical ability. And there's either two things that could happen. Either you're going to get totally smoked in the King's Gambit and get battered, you can get checkmated in like 10 moves, or you'll learn something and it'll be a great experience. So, if that does happen to you and you get crushed in the King's Gambit, it doesn't matter. Your opponent's created like a piece of art that he's going to be really proud of, and then you're going to have like a little lesson to back that up. And it's always then a cool story to then talk about afterwards. So I would always suggest take it because there's going to be some great stories at the end of it. So what's the idea? Well, with the King's Gambit, so what white is trying to do is try to distract one of your central pawns away from the centre. And he does this by playing f4, and after you take, white at some point is then going to try and take over the centre with d4, and he's going to get his pieces out to very active squares and hopefully checkmate the black king. So that's kind of basically in essence what it's all about. The downside is after knight to f3, black actually can hold on to his material, and the main line here goes g5 and looks very odd. I mean, let's face it, black's not developed anything. He's just played another king move and he's weakened his king side. But the argument here from black is, well, I'm not actually down materially here, I'm still up a pawn, so if I'm able to survive this initial skirmish, I've actually got a much better endgame as a result. Now there's some really exciting lines that can continue here. One that I'll just quickly show you is this bishop c4 line, and after g4 white can actually gambit his knight now, and this is a very exciting position. I would say actually this is probably even wilder than the position I'm going to show you. It's known as the Museo Gambit, and there's all kinds of crazy stuff here. I'll show you just one really cool line here where you sacrifice the bishop and then you sacrifice a pawn. And yeah, you get this weird looking position. And actually, I've played this over the board, not over the board, sorry, as if you ever get this over the board. I've played this in correspondence chess. I played in a tournament that had this position. You can actually see it on my YouTube channel if you check through some of my videos, where we reached this starting position, and weirdly enough, white won the majority of his games. And you're looking at the Lichess database, it's showing up at 64%, 70%. There's a reason why white scores particularly well. It's just because he's got such good development, and black's king is just simply not safe in this line. Anyway, let's go back to this g5. So the other move, the main line, is c4 here. And the idea is this: if black captures here, he's going to ruin his pawn structure, and it just, you're going to cut through black like Swiss cheese now. So black normally doesn't accept that. He pushes with g4. There's another advantage to playing h4 as well. in that in just the short term it stops the queen from being able to access this square, because the knight is normally going to be moving in the king's gambit against these aggressive things. So by playing h4 you allow your knight to be able to move away without having to worry about the nasty looking checks along there. So now here, this is where the Allgaier gambit then starts. So now knight g5, a very odd, very weird looking move. The main line is knight to e5, and that's known as the Czergiecki gambit. And there's lots of exciting lines here, but the main idea for white is he's going to recapture this pawn, and he's going to have just a fine game. There are some incredibly crazy variations with h5 as long as the long whip variation, but we're going too much into King's Gambit theory now. I think what I just want to show you here now is what happens after knight to g5. We've reached our tabia position of the Allgaier, and I asked you at the start of the video, what do you consider, who do you think is winning in this position? Well, the jury's kind of maybe out on this one. If you whack this on an engine, it will say -2 for black, and you're doing particularly well. The reason why is now black can just play h6. And there's a bit of a problem for this white knight. It's got nowhere it can go to. It can't go back to any of these squares. It can't go forward because it gets captured. It can't come here because the rook will take it back here. So what it then does, well, actually this was kind of white's plan to begin with, because now the white knight will just sacrifice itself on f7. A crazy line. Now, this is still, I consider this called the, I still consider this the Allgaier Gambit, but weirdly enough, it's got a different, slightly different name on the Lichess database. It's coming up with the Czergiecki Gambit again, and then the Cotter Gambit. So I think there's something wrong with our opening lines. I've never called it the Cotter Gambit. I don't know who calls it the Cotter Gambit. Anyway, so what's the idea? Well, black has to take this knight. I mean, you know, so he's got a fork that he has to deal with. But there's a bit of an issue for black. He's up a clear knight, that's pretty good. But his king can't castle anymore. It's not in the most safe looking position. And white's pieces are going to basically annihilate this very weak blanket of pawns and take back some material, but also probably be looking to checkmate the black king as well. Now, this line really reminds me of another line I'll just show you very briefly in the Petrov defense that looks a little bit like this. So something called the Cochrane Gambit. But I would say that this line that we've just looked at with the Allgaier Gambit, so with h6 here, I would say that this is even better than the Cochrane Gambit, because in that position that I just showed you earlier, if I just show you a little snapshot here, so look at this position and then look at this position, I would say that the black king's not too badly placed here. He's got a knight that's defending him, it's doing quite a good job. He's still got a blanket of pawns that he might be able to hide under in some circumstances. So, going back to here, now, this is where things get a little bit mad. Now, the main line, it's really hard to say a main line because there really isn't that many games in the Mastered Games database. What I will say is Allgaier, in his original analysis, suggested taking with the queen. And there's actually, interestingly enough, another game by Paul Morphy that also suggests taking here. But I would say, if you want to play this really well, I would maybe just develop your knight or play d4 here. And the idea for white is basically saying, look, that these pawns are just rubbish. I'm going to capture these whenever I want to. But for now, I'm just going to focus on my development and get myself a good position. And by the way, your king is still rubbish in this position. So at any point, I can always just start attacking your king if I need to. You know, and black is going to have to probably waste a couple tempes just to get the king safe. And it's not clear how black is going to be able to survive this position in the short term. So that's kind of the idea, and what I would suggest is probably a better way to play this particular line. Bishop c4 is also interesting as well. The downside of this, though, is that this can just go straight into this d4 line, and it might seem strange that black is giving up a pawn, but after bishop takes, you just move your king to g7, and now look, you've actually opened up your bishop here. So this is a giving back a pawn, but just to get some development back into this position. Okay, so let's have a look at the actual game that happened. So my opponent here, he took with his queen, took on g4. I now moved my knight onto f6, hitting the queen. He then took the other pawn, and there's already some pressure that I've got to deal with here. He's got his pawn that could move forward. That's already going to be causing me some issues against this pinned knight. However, here I played what is the best move, and the move that's been played the most on the Lichess database and even on the Master Games database. Here I played the move bishop to d6. Weirdly, this has a name. It's called the Allgaier's variation, and it's called the Horny Defense. Bit of an interesting name, but there we go. And, well, it looks a bit strange because I've got my bishop on d6, which is blocking in my pawn on d7, so I'm not going to be able to get this bishop out anytime soon. But in actual fact, this bishop is doing a really good job because it's not only getting a tempo on the queen, but it's also indirectly maybe threatening this g3 square, which would at least, I guess, tit for tat with white, stop his king from being able to castle. And it's just a bit of an annoying move to then have to face. So in the actual game, my opponent played bishop to c4. Interestingly enough, e5 is the most played move here on the Lichess database, which is actually a mistake. We're going to come on to a little bit why e5 in a moment wasn't such a good move. But in the game here, my opponent threw in this check. And as I said, my king is absolutely fine. It moves over to g7. It's actually on quite a safe square on this dark square because it's the same color as this bishop, but this bishop is still going to take maybe 2 or 3 moves to really get into the game. So actually, as I say, it's not the best placed piece here. Now, there's a few issues now for white. He's got to move his queen somewhere. And if he does that, that gives me then time to maybe prepare my defenses. So just to give you an example, let's say it comes to f5 in this position. Well, what I can do against this now, I can throw in this check, flick that in, and now I can actually flick out d5 here. And this is a really nice move because it's not only hitting the queen, it's also hitting this bishop. So it's a very nasty fork that white could just simply fall into. Other moves that fail, maybe if you put your queen onto f3. I was looking at some interesting lines here where you now play knight to c6. There we go. So now you're just going to jump into this square, into either one of these squares. I think preferably e5 because you're going to then fork the bishop and the queen. And it's just a bad position for white. In the game, though, he played e5. And this is also a mistake. It looks pretty good because you're going to yourself, yes, I've got this beautiful fork. The problem is, I don't need to actually react to this fork. I can actually just take the pawn. Why can't the queen take back, you might be wondering? Well, rook to e8 wins on the spot. Okay, I'm going to pin this queen. I'm going to win it, and it's going to be a very nice game here. So after I took back that pawn, my opponent realized, oh my goodness, I'm actually in a bit of danger here. He now moved his queen back to f2. And this is where I can now flick out d5. If you can get this d5 move in the King's Gambit in pretty much every variation, including in the accepted lines, you're doing really well. If you can get it out with tempo, then it's just totally winning for black now. As now this bishop is forced to move back to a pretty uncomfortable square. It doesn't really matter where it goes to, but I'm just going to get a very good advantage here now. So after the bishop moved to e2, I now jump my knight into e4, hitting the queen. The queen came to e3, and here I increase the pressure now with bishop to g3 with check. If he moves his king over to d1, this is just it's an absolute disaster because I can get this in with a nasty windmill, and well, I mean, after stuff like this, I mean, it just looks awful. Even here, actually, if he moves his king over, ooh, runs straight into that. So a pretty big disaster if he moves over there. So instead, after I checked, he moved his king over to f1, and it's not totally lights out for my opponent. He has got this bishop f3 idea to maybe defend his position if need be. But now I keep the pressure on. Bishop to f2 is just a nice move as I'm hitting the queen, and there are some potentially in the future some checkmating ideas with this rook coming to f8 and the knight jumping to g3. So the queen comes to f4. I move my rook over to f8. He throws a check in. Doesn't matter, I defend with my queen. I'm happy to swap off queens because I've still got this particular threat in line. He moved his bishop onto f3, I threw in a check. And okay, this was probably not the most cleanest way to win this particular game, but I'm still up 4 points of material, and I've got a very good position here. Here my opponent went a bit haywire. He decided to play c4. I don't really understand. I think maybe just this is absolutely fine here in this position. Notice actually you can't take this pawn, by the way, because I just throw in this check and pick up this bishop. But here he plays c4, which is just a very not a great move. And now I took here on f3, which is, I think, a really nice move. It's a little deflection, removing the defender tactic, because this bishop was defending this e2 square. And after he took back, I then pick up this bishop. I've got a very nice position now. I'm up 5 points material, and I'm going to just pick up a few more pawns and have a winning position. I'll just fast forward a little bit. Not really much more to really see in this particular game. It was just me trying to grind out this particular position. Here he now moved his knight in the way to block this check, and after this I just had a very good game. Here I've just now, it was actually quite funny, the game continued a bit longer, but White has got zero counterplay. He's got these two pawns that can't move anywhere. If he tries to move this pawn, which he ends up trying to do, I just blocked it with a6, which is a bit kind of really evil of me. And I've got this pass pawn over here that I can just push down the board and hopefully win the game. And his rook's not going to really be able to do anything. Even if it was able to infiltrate down to try and pick up one of these pawns, it's not an issue because this knight is always defending. And there's some other nasty things. If he ever tries to think about maybe getting a rook for the two knights, it's still a totally lost position because he has to deal with this rook. So a very nice win from the Allgaier Gambit. As I say, I really enjoy going into the main line King's Gambit. And as I say, it's always a good idea to, at the starting position, just accept it. See what's going to happen, because there's, as I say, I'm going to just think in the mind of the King's Gambit player just for a moment. Because I've played the King's Gambit a bit, and no one ever accepts that pawn. They always end up doing some really boring line. Well, they play like this, or they do d6 or something, and just some pants declining line. No one ever accepts the Gambit. And, okay, your opponent might be licking their lips going, oh, brilliant. Finally, I can use that bit of theory that I've not used ever. But actually, if you just accept it and actually kind of go, okay, let's test your theory. Let's actually see how much you really know about this particular line. Then you can get some very interesting positions. And as I say, if you get smoked, who cares? Because you at least got a nice game that you can look at afterwards, a few lessons, and it's just, you might have created a masterpiece for your opponent, and then you're part of that masterpiece, I guess, in some way, by getting absolutely crushed by your opponent. But there we go. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like what you see, make sure you leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and comment below what your favourite King's Gambit variation is. Anyway, I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.